Everything seemed perfect in the life of a powerful millionaire who believed he had found love again. But his attentive and silent daughter felt that something was wrong with her father's new relationship. A revealing phone call from the stepmother put him face to face with a cruel plan. The Tuesday morning sun bathed the enormous glass panes of the office on the 35th floor of the most modern commercial building in Chicago. From up there, the city looked like an organized anthill, with its tiny cars racing along the avenues and people walking hurriedly on the sidewalks. For Richard Morgan Shaw, that view always brought a sense of accomplishment. At 52, he had built an empire that began with a small electronics store on the city's north side and had transformed into the largest technology and innovation network in the country. Richard was a man of average height, with well-cut grey hair and brown eyes that showed the intensity of someone who always knew exactly what he wanted. His hands, marked by years of hard work, no longer held screwdrivers and pliers, but rather gold pens that signed multi-million-dollar contracts. He always wore elegant suits, but never exaggerated ones. He liked simplicity, even when surrounded by luxury. He was a man who spoke little and listened a lot, a characteristic that had helped him make the right decisions in the most difficult moments of his career. Richard's life had been marked by great joys and deep sorrows. He had married young to Helen, a math teacher he met while studying business administration at Northwestern. She was his safe harbor, the person who always believed in his dreams, even when they seemed impossible. Together, they built not only a family, but a true partnership. Helen helped him with the company's books in the early days, while taking care of Isabella, the couple's daughter, who was born when Richard was 28. Isabella was a special girl from a young age, intelligent, curious, and with a sharp perception that sometimes even frightened her parents. She had curly brown hair, bright, green eyes, and a smile that lit up any room. From an early age, she showed an interest in her father's business, asking questions that revealed a surprising understanding for her age. Richard used to joke that she had been born with a business chip installed in her head. Tragedy struck when Isabella was only 12 years old. Helen discovered an aggressive cancer that, despite all possible treatments and the best medical care money could buy, took her in less than 2 years. Richard was devastated. For a time he thought about giving up everything. The company, which had always been his passion, became merely a survival mechanism. He worked 16 hours a day to avoid thinking, to not feel the emptiness that had taken over his life. Isabella, then 14, was the one who brought him back to reality. On a rainy Saturday afternoon, she entered his home office and found her father looking at old photographs. Without saying a word, she sat down beside him and held his hand. It was then that Richard realized he was not alone, that Helen had left in their daughter not only her physical features but also her wisdom and inner strength. The following years were ones of rebuilding. Father and daughter created a routine where they took care of each other. Richard returned to dedicating himself to the company with renewed vigor, while Isabella excelled in her studies and showed an increasing interest in the world of business. She would spend her afternoons in her father's office, doing her homework while observing meetings and absorbing knowledge like a sponge. When Isabella turned 18, Richard had already established the company as a national market leader and was beginning to expand into other North American countries. She enrolled in the business administration program at the same university where her parents had met, and she continued to be Richard's closest person. She was the one who advised him on personal decisions and even on some aspects of the business where her youthful perspective brought valuable insights. It was exactly on Richard's 50th birthday that everything changed again. During a charity event organized by the company, he met Cassandra Vance Miller. She was 35, had a degree in psychology, well-kept blonde hair, expressive blue eyes, and a presence that commanded attention. Cassandra worked as a human resources consultant and had been hired to coordinate a social project for the company focused on the professional development of at-risk youth. Their first meeting took place at a technical meeting about the project. Cassandra presented her ideas with confidence and demonstrated a deep knowledge of people management. Richard was impressed not only with her professional competence, but also with her apparent dedication to the social cause. She spoke with passion about the importance of giving opportunities to those who needed them most, and that deeply touched the heart of a man who had built everything from scratch. The professional meetings gradually became personal. Cassandra was attentive, caring, and showed a genuine interest in Richard's story. She patiently listened to his memories of Helen, his challenges as a single father, and his dreams for the company's future. She knew exactly the right words for every moment, offered sensible advice, and little by little began to fill the emotional void that had existed in his life for so many years. For Richard, Cassandra represented a second chance. After 8 years of loneliness, he had finally found someone with whom he could share not only his bed, but also his thoughts, fears, and hopes. She was different from Helen, of course, but she brought a renewing energy that made him feel alive again. It was as if a part of him that had fallen asleep with his wife's death had reawakened. The relationship lasted for 2 years. Cassandra was gradually integrated into Richard's family and professional life. She attended business dinners, accompanied him on corporate trips, and slowly gained the trust of the company's employees and partners. Everyone saw her as a positive influence in their boss's life, someone who had brought a smile back to a man who had spent years being overly serious and focused only on work. Isabella, now 20, watched everything with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was happy to see her father showing signs of happiness she hadn't seen since her mother's death. Richard had started laughing spontaneously again, making plans that didn't just involve work, taking better care of his appearance and even listening to music at home again. On the other hand, something indefinable bothered her about Cassandra. It wasn't jealousy, Isabella was sure of that. She had always wished for her father to find someone special, someone who could make him happy. Her concern was something else, more subtle and difficult to explain. There were small details in Cassandra's behavior that didn't quite fit the image she projected. It was the way her eyes changed expression when she thought no one was looking, or how she always seemed to know exactly what to say in every situation, as if she were following a rehearsed script. Isabella had an exceptional memory, and an observational ability she had inherited from her mother. Helen always said that her daughter had a radar for people, an intuition that rarely failed. And that radar was sending out warning signals regarding Cassandra, although Isabella couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The wedding took place in an intimate ceremony, only for family and close friends. It was held in the garden of Richard's house, an elegant brownstone in Lincoln Park, with classic decor and a view of a well-kept garden. Cassandra was stunning in a delicate lace dress, and Richard couldn't hide his emotion. During the vows, he spoke of second chances and how Cassandra had brought color back into his life. She, in turn, promised to be his faithful companion and to care for the family they were forming. Isabella was her father's best woman. She wore an elegant navy, blue dress and smiled throughout the ceremony, but close friends noticed that her smile didn't reach her eyes. She played her part perfectly, gave a moving speech about the importance of her father's happiness, and wished the new couple all the happiness in the world. Internally, however, she remained on alert. In the first few months after the wedding, family life seemed to have found a new balance. Cassandra moved into Richard's house and, with great diplomacy, began making small changes to the decor and the organization of the household routine. She never imposed anything, but suggested changes always with convincing arguments about functionality or beauty. Gradually, the house began to bear her personal mark, although she always kept elements that honored Helen's memory. Richard was visibly lighter and more energized. He started playing sports again, something he had given up after his first wife's death. Cassandra encouraged him to take care of his health, accompanied him to the community gym, and even convinced him to have a complete checkup with specialists. She always said she wanted many years by his side, and that it was important for him to take good care of himself. In the workplace, Cassandra also began to have a more noticeable presence. Richard started asking for her opinion on people management issues, an area where she had training and experience. Sometimes she would participate in important meetings, always positioning herself intelligently and contributing valuable insights. The older employees found it a bit strange, as Richard had always been very private about his personal life, but they acknowledged that her contributions were pertinent. It was during one of these meetings that Cassandra suggested a restructuring of the company's investments. She argued that the economic climate was favorable for diversifying the portfolio, especially in international markets where American technology was gaining recognition. Richard was impressed with her analysis and began to seriously consider the possibility. Isabella, who used to attend some important meetings as a form of practical learning, was present when Cassandra made the presentation. She carefully observed every slide, every argument, every number presented. Everything seemed very well-founded, very professional, but something continued to bother her. It was as if the presentation was too good for someone whose background and experience were in psychology and human resources. After the meeting, Isabella tried to talk to her father about her impressions, but cautiously, so as not to sound like a jealous daughter trying to sabotage the marriage. Richard, however, was enthusiastic about the possibilities Cassandra had presented. He said he finally had a partner who not only understood his personal life, but also contributed to his professional growth. That evening during the family dinner, Cassandra casually mentioned that she had some contacts abroad who could be useful for the new investments. She spoke of a group of European investors interested in partnerships with solid American companies and suggested that it might be worth exploring this possibility. Richard showed interest and asked her to develop the idea further. Isabella watched everything in silence, pretending to be focused on her chocolate dessert, but her senses were on high alert. There was something in the way Cassandra talked about these contacts that sounded rehearsed, as if she had had this conversation planned for a long time. Furthermore, she noticed that Cassandra avoided giving specific details about how she had met these supposed investors or what the exact nature of her professional relationship with them was. That night, Isabella stayed awake for hours thinking about everything she had observed in recent months. She made a mental list of small details that bothered her. The way Cassandra always knew exactly what her father wanted to hear, how her stories about the past sometimes changed small details, how she always changed the subject when someone asked very specific questions about her life before meeting Richard. Isabella knew she might be paranoid, that perhaps her instincts were being influenced by the natural difficulty of accepting someone in the place her mother had occupied, but Helen had always taught her to trust her intuition, especially when it came to situations that could affect the people she loved. And at that moment, her intuition was screaming that something was wrong, even if she couldn't yet identify exactly what. What Isabella didn't know was that her intuition was absolutely right. While she was trying to understand her confused feelings, a few feet away in the couple's bedroom, Cassandra was taking advantage of her husband's deep sleep to review messages on a secret phone. Messages that confirmed that everything was going according to plan and that it would soon be time to move on to the final phase of a scheme that had been carefully orchestrated for more than 3 years. The following days brought a different kind of excitement to the Shaw family's routine. Cassandra had managed to schedule a video conference with the European investors, and Richard was visibly excited about the opening possibilities. During breakfast on Thursday morning, she explained in detail how the investment process would work, using technical terms that impressed even Richard, who was not a man to be easily impressed. The proposal was ambitious. The foreign investors offered a partnership that would allow Richard's company to expand rapidly into the European market, with guarantees of exclusivity in certain regions and financial support for adapting products to international standards. In return, a considerable initial investment would be required as a counterpart, demonstrating the commitment of the American side. Isabella was present during the explanation, drinking her latte and pretending to read the news on her tablet. But in reality, she was absorbing every word spoken by Cassandra. The young woman had an exceptional ability to process complex information, an inheritance from both her parents' genes and years of close proximity to the business world. And the more she listened, the more her suspicions intensified. There was something in the way Cassandra presented the numbers that didn't quite add up. She spoke about profit margins and growth projections with a precision that seemed rehearsed. But when Richard asked more technical questions about specific aspects of the European market, her answers were vaguer, filled with generalities that sounded convincing, but offered no concrete information. Richard, being emotionally involved and confident in his wife, did not notice these nuances. To him, Cassandra was just being cautious with confidential information, a behavior he himself adopted in his business dealings. Besides, he was impressed with her knowledge of international investments, an area he had always wanted to venture into but had never found the right opportunity. After breakfast, Richard left for the office with an enthusiasm that Isabella hadn't seen in a long time. Cassandra said she needed to spend the day organizing documents and preparing materials for the video conference that would take place the following week. Isabella, for her part, had classes at the university, but her mind was completely focused on the events at home. During the break between classes, Isabella decided to call Robert Silverman, the family's trusted lawyer, for over 15 years. Robert had been a personal friend of Helen's and had always maintained a close relationship with the Shaws, being one of the few people in whom Richard placed absolute trust for sensitive matters. Robert answered promptly, as he always did when it came to any member of the Shaw family. Isabella carefully explained that she would like to better understand how international investments worked, especially partnerships with European groups. She said she was thinking of doing an academic paper on the subject and wanted technical information on necessary documentation and legal procedures. The lawyer, always willing to help, explained in detail the processes involved in such operations. He talked about the need for validation of consular documents, verification of the foreign partner's integrity through competent bodies, and especially about the importance of involving lawyers specializing in international law from the beginning of the negotiations. When Isabella specifically asked about the possibility of conducting this type of operation without the direct involvement of the company's usual lawyers, Robert became visibly concerned. He explained that this practice, although not illegal, was extremely risky and completely inadvisable. He said that in his years of experience, he had seen many solid companies face serious problems by trusting intermediaries without proper legal supervision. The conversation with Robert exponentially increased Isabella's concerns. She thanked him for the information, claiming it would be very useful for her academic paper, but in reality her mind was already formulating a plan to investigate Cassandra's true intentions more deeply. That afternoon, upon returning home, Isabella found Cassandra in an intense phone conversation in the office Richard had set up for her to use when she needed to work from home. The door was ajar, and Isabella could hear fragments of the conversation. Cassandra was talking about timelines, documents that needed to be prepared, and the importance of keeping everything confidential until the procedures were completed. Isabella pretended to be looking for a book on the shelf near the office, trying to catch more details of the conversation. It was then that she heard Cassandra mention something about finalizing the transfer before anyone gets suspicious and making sure the documents look authentic. Isabella's heart raced. Those words had a completely different tone from the normal professional conversations she was used to hearing at home. Cassandra noticed Isabella's presence and quickly changed the tone of the conversation, starting to talk about general bureaucratic issues and ending the call shortly after. She greeted her stepdaughter with a warm smile, asked how her day at the university had been, and commented that she was organizing some details of the international project to present to Richard. Isabella responded politely, but her mind was on high alert. She went up to her room and spent hours reflecting on everything she had observed in recent days. She decided she needed more concrete information before taking her suspicions to her father, as she knew he was emotionally involved and might interpret her concerns as jealousy or resistance to the new marriage. On Friday, Richard spent the entire day at the company's office involved in meetings about the possible investment restructuring. Cassandra took the opportunity to go out, claiming she needed to handle banking matters related to the international project. Isabella, who had no classes that day, decided to stay home and take the opportunity to investigate. She knew she was violating Cassandra's privacy, but her intuition screamed that something was seriously wrong. She entered the makeshift office and began to carefully examine the documents on the desk. She found several sheets with notes in a handwriting she didn't recognize, containing numbers, dates, and names that made no sense to her. Among the papers was a business card from an international consulting firm she had never heard of. She discreetly wrote down the company's name and phone number, intending to research it later. She also found some notes about banks in tax havens and routes for transferring funds that seemed extremely suspicious to her. The most intriguing discovery was a small notebook hidden under other documents containing what appeared to be a detailed timeline of actions. There were specific dates, starting with gain complete trust and ending with execute final transfer, followed by immediate departure. The timeline was almost at its end, with most items already marked as completed. Isabella felt a mixture of fear and anger taking over her chest. This was not an investment project, it was clearly an elaborate plan to scam her father. She discreetly photographed the most important pages with her cell phone, taking care to put everything back exactly as she found it. As she was reorganizing the papers, she heard the sound of keys at the front door. Cassandra had returned earlier than expected. Isabella quickly left the office and went up to her room, trying to hide her agitation. Cassandra greeted her normally, commented that she had quickly resolved her commitments, and went to the office. A few minutes later, Isabella heard a muffled exclamation from downstairs. She went down silently and saw Cassandra examining the documents carefully, clearly checking if anyone had touched her things. Fortunately, Isabella had been careful enough not to leave any obvious traces. That night, during dinner, Cassandra announced that the video conference with the European investors had been rescheduled for the following Monday, and that it would probably be necessary to finalize all the documentation by Wednesday. She said the investors were eager to close the deal and move on to other opportunities, so it was important to act quickly. Richard was enthusiastic about the speed of the process, interpreting it as a sign that it was indeed a valuable opportunity. Cassandra explained that, to maintain competitive secrecy, it would be better to conduct the final negotiations without initially involving the company's legal team, presenting them only with the finalized contract for formal validation. Isabella almost choked on her juice when she heard this suggestion. It was exactly the type of procedure Robert had described as extremely dangerous. She tried to intervene in the conversation, suggesting that it might be prudent to involve the lawyers from the beginning. But Richard said that Cassandra was right about the need for discretion in deals of this magnitude. After dinner, Isabella went up to her room and spent hours analyzing the photographs she had taken of the documents. She searched the internet for the consulting firm mentioned on the business card and discovered that it had been recently created, had an address in a location that served as a headquarters for hundreds of other companies, and had no history of significant operations. She also researched the banks mentioned in the notes and found that some of them were known for facilitating questionable financial operations. The more she investigated, the more the situation revealed itself as an elaborate fraud scheme. Isabella knew she had to act quickly, but she also needed more compelling evidence. She decided that over the weekend, she would try to find out more about Cassandra's past and the supposed European investors. If her suspicions were correct, she would have only a few days to save her father from a financial and emotional catastrophe. On Saturday morning, while Richard was playing tennis at the club and Cassandra claimed to have personal errands to run, Isabella took the opportunity to conduct a more in-depth investigation. She used her internet knowledge and research skills to dig up everything she could find on Cassandra Vance Miller. What she discovered was disturbing. She found records of a woman with a very similar name who had been involved in financial scandals in other states, always using the same method, gaining the trust of successful businessmen through romantic relationships and then carrying out sophisticated scams. The photographs were not clear enough to be absolutely sure, but there were unsettling physical similarities. Even more disturbing was discovering that Cassandra had moved to a new city at the exact time the scandals came to light, and that her arrival in Chicago coincided with the period when she began attending events where she could meet prosperous businessmen. At that moment, Isabella was certain that her intuition was correct. Cassandra was not a passionate psychologist who had genuinely become interested in her father. She was a professional con artist who had chosen Richard as her next target, studied his habits and emotional needs, and assembled a perfect strategy to win his trust. The discovery brought a mixture of relief at having identified the danger and despair at realizing how close her father was to falling into a trap that could destroy not only his fortune, but also his ability to trust someone again. Isabella knew she had only a few hours to prevent a catastrophe. The video conference was on Monday, and from the dinner conversation, it seemed Cassandra intended to speed up the whole process during the week. She needed to find a way to warn her father without sounding like a jealous daughter trying to sabotage his marriage, and she needed evidence so compelling that not even Richard's enamored heart could ignore. Its Sunday dawned overcast in Chicago, with that typical grey autumn sky that seemed to perfectly reflect Isabella's state of mind. She had spent a nearly sleepless night, mentally reviewing all the information she had collected about Cassandra and trying to devise a strategy to warn her father without sounding like a possessive or paranoid daughter. Richard woke up excited, talking about the video conference that would take place the next day. During breakfast, he commented enthusiastically on the possibilities of international expansion and how lucky he felt to have found a partner who not only loved him, but also contributed to the growth of his business. Cassandra smiled sweetly, serving him coffee and agreeing with every word, perfectly playing the role of the devoted wife and business partner. Isabella watched the scene with a heavy heart. Seeing her father so happy and confident, without suspecting he was being manipulated by a professional con artist, was almost unbearable. She tried a few subtle approaches during the conversation, asking questions about the European investors and suggesting that it might be interesting to do more detailed research on them before committing. Richard interpreted his daughter's suggestions as the natural caution of a future business administrator, praised her concern for due diligence, but explained that Cassandra had already done all the necessary verification and that the investors had impeccable credentials. Cassandra took the opportunity to show some documents that proved the group's seriousness, apparently official papers with seals and signatures that looked legitimate to someone inexperienced in detecting forgeries. After breakfast, Richard left to play golf with some business friends, a Sunday tradition he had maintained for years. Cassandra claimed to have a headache and said she would spend the day resting and organizing materials for the video conference. Isabella pretended to have studies to do, but in reality, she was planning to use the time for a final attempt to gather conclusive evidence. As soon as Richard left the house, Isabella noticed a change in Cassandra's behavior. The mask of the caring, slightly tired wife fell away completely. She went to the office with determined steps and began a series of phone calls, speaking in a low voice but with an authoritarian tone that Isabella had never noticed before. Isabella positioned herself strategically in the living room, pretending to read a book, but in reality she was focused on trying to catch fragments of the conversations. What she managed to hear alarmed her even more. Cassandra spoke of tight schedules, documents that needed to be ready by the next morning, and the importance of executing everything before anyone could interfere. In one of the calls, Isabella clearly heard Cassandra say that the target was completely hooked and that it would be easier than we imagined. These words made her blood run cold. There was no longer any doubt that her father was the victim of an elaborate scam, and that Cassandra was much more dangerous and calculating than she had imagined. Taking advantage of a moment when Cassandra went out to take a call in the garden, Isabella quickly entered the office and tried to collect more evidence. This time, she found a second notebook hidden in a drawer. This one contained even more detailed information about Richard, his routine, his habits, his emotional vulnerabilities, and even psychological analyses on how to manipulate him effectively. The notebook revealed that Cassandra had meticulously studied Richard's life long before approaching him. She knew about his relationship with Helen, about how he had dealt with grief, about his dedication to his daughter, and had used all this information to build a personality that would be irresistible to him. It was like a manipulation manual specific to Richard Shaw. Even more shocking was the discovery that there were other names in the notebook, other businessmen who had apparently been previous targets of similar schemes. Isabella recognized some of the names from financial newspapers. They were men who had faced unexplained financial problems in recent years. The final piece of the puzzle was falling into place, and the picture that emerged was terrifying. When she heard Cassandra returning to the house, Isabella quickly photographed the most important pages of the notebook and left the office. Her heart was beating so hard, she was sure Cassandra could hear it. She went up to her room and spent the next few minutes trying to calm down and organize her findings. Isabella knew she now had enough evidence to prove Cassandra's true intentions, but she also knew that her father was so emotionally involved that it would be very difficult to convince him. Richard was a smart man in business, but when it came to matters of the heart, especially after years of loneliness, he was vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. She decided the best strategy would be to try to alert Robert, the family lawyer, and ask him to find a way to approach Richard. Robert had enough moral authority to be heard, and his legal experience would allow him to evaluate the evidence in a technical and convincing way. She called Robert and arranged a meeting for the early afternoon, claiming she had discovered some worrying information about the international project and needed legal guidance. Robert, always attentive to the Shaw family's interests, agreed to meet her at his office, even though it was a Sunday. Before leaving to meet Robert, Isabella decided to do one last check in Cassandra's office. She wanted to be sure she had documented everything properly. It was then that she made a discovery that left her completely floored. Hidden among other papers, she found a document that appeared to be a forged death certificate with the name of Richard Shaw. The document was dated for the following week and indicated death by heart attack. Isabella immediately understood the macabre implications of this discovery. Cassandra was not only planning to steal her father's money, but also to eliminate any possibility of him recovering the funds or reporting the scam. The situation was much more serious than she had imagined. With trembling hands, she photographed the document and left the house quickly, claiming she was going to meet friends from the university. During the drive to Robert's office, she tried to control the panic that was taking over her body. It was no longer just a matter of protecting the family's assets, but literally of saving her father's life. Robert received her in his private office, an elegant room with shelves full of law books and a large window, overlooking Michigan Avenue. He immediately noticed Isabella's agitated state and offered her water, asking what was happening. Isabella took a deep breath and began to report everything she had discovered in recent days. She showed him the photographs of the notebooks, explained her internet research, recounted the suspicious conversations she had overheard, and finally, with a choked voice, showed him the image of the forged death certificate. Robert listened to everything in silence, with an increasingly grave expression, occasionally taking notes and asking for clarification on specific details. When Isabella finished her account, Robert remained silent for a few minutes, carefully analyzing all the evidence. His experience in complex cases allowed him to immediately recognize the sophistication of the scheme and the seriousness of the situation. He had seen elaborate scams during his career, but rarely something so well planned and with such serious implications. Robert explained to Isabella that the evidence was more than enough to characterize fraud and criminal conspiracy, and that the forged death certificate indicated even more sinister intentions. He was clearly impressed with the young woman's intelligence and courage, but also concerned about the risks involved. Robert's first recommendation was to contact the police immediately, but Isabella convinced him that this could alert Cassandra and cause her to advance her plans or simply flee. They agreed that it was necessary to first warn Richard and prevent him from signing any documents in the next day's video conference. Robert suggested that he himself call Richard and invent a legal emergency that would require the postponement of any international negotiations. This way, they would buy time to present the evidence in an organized and convincing manner, without Cassandra suspecting she had been discovered. Isabella agreed with the strategy, but was worried that Cassandra might realize something was wrong if Robert suddenly appeared with legal objections. They decided that Robert would call, claiming to have discovered irregularities in documents from other companies involved in similar deals, and that, as a precaution, he recommended a more detailed review before any signing. As they worked out the details of the approach, Robert made a few calls to contacts in the justice system, checking for criminal records associated with the names Isabella had discovered. What they found confirmed the worst suspicions. There were multiple ongoing investigations related to similar financial schemes, and some of the companies mentioned in Cassandra's documents were on the list of organizations suspected of fraudulent activities. Robert assured Isabella they would do everything to protect Richard, but also warned her of the importance of maintaining absolute secrecy until they could act in a coordinated manner. Any sign that they had uncovered the plan could put both Richard and herself at risk. When Isabella returned home in the late afternoon, she found Richard excitedly telling Cassandra about his golf game and how his business friends had been impressed when he mentioned the international investment opportunity. Cassandra smiled and showed interest, but Isabella could now clearly see the falsehood behind that mask. During dinner, Cassandra commented that she had confirmed all the details for the next day's video conference and that the transfer documents were practically ready for signing. She said the investors were eager to finalize the deal quickly, as they had other opportunities waiting and couldn't wait long. Richard seemed completely convinced of the legitimacy and urgency of the deal. He commented that he had rarely felt so confident about a business decision and credited part of that confidence to Cassandra's support and knowledge. It was painful for Isabella to see how her father had been skillfully manipulated by someone who had meticulously studied his vulnerabilities. That night, after Richard and Cassandra retired to their room, Isabella stayed awake planning the next steps. Robert would call early in the morning with the excuse about legal irregularities, and she would try to support him subtly, showing concern about the speed of the process. Isabella knew the next few hours would be crucial. If they could prevent the signing of the documents and present the evidence convincingly, they could save her father both financially and physically. If they failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. As she tried to fall asleep, Isabella thought of her mother, Helen, and how she would handle a situation like this. Helen always said that when someone we love is in danger, we find strengths we didn't even know we had. At that moment, Isabella felt exactly those forces mobilizing within her. The clock on the nightstand showed 2 in the morning when Isabella finally managed to fall asleep, but it was a restless sleep, full of dreams where she tried to warn her father about dangers he refused to see. She didn't know that in the next 12 hours, her courage and determination would be tested in a way she had never imagined. And she also didn't know that Cassandra in the next room was awake much later, finalizing the last details of a plan that had taken months to execute. For Cassandra, this would be the last night in the Shaw house. The next morning, after the video conference and the transfer of funds, she would disappear forever, leaving behind only destruction and a completely devastated man. What neither woman could foresee was that fate had prepared a twist that would completely change the course of events, and that the intuition and courage of a dedicated daughter would be the only obstacle between an experienced con artist and her chosen victim. Monday dawned with a shy sun trying to break through the grey clouds hovering over Chicago. For Isabella, waking up that morning was like waking from a nightmare, only to find that reality was even more frightening. She knew this would be the most important day of her life, the day she would have to save her father from a tragedy he couldn't even see. Richard got up earlier than usual, clearly anxious and excited about the video conference scheduled for 10 in the morning. During breakfast, he was talkative and optimistic, commenting on how that day would mark the beginning of a new phase for the company. Cassandra, for her part, displayed a serenity that impressed Isabella. For someone about to execute a multi-million-dollar scam, she seemed completely controlled and confident. At 8 in the morning, as Richard was preparing to leave for the office, the phone rang. It was Robert, doing exactly as they had planned. In a worried voice, he explained that he had discovered irregularities in similar documents from other companies involving European investor groups, and that he strongly recommended postponing any signing until a more detailed analysis could be done. Richard was visibly annoyed by the call. He explained to Robert that the investors were extremely reliable, that Cassandra had personally verified all the credentials, and that postponing the process could mean losing a unique opportunity. Robert insisted, citing legal liability issues and mentioning that he had contacted authorities specializing in international financial crimes. Cassandra, who was listening to the conversation, showed a slight irritation for the first time. She suggested that Robert was being overly cautious and that his interference could jeopardize a legitimate and extremely profitable deal. She said she understood the lawyer's concern, but that she had personally verified every detail, and there was no reason for suspicion. Richard was torn between the caution of his trusted lawyer and his enthusiasm for the project his wife had presented. He decided he would hold the video conference as planned, but would postpone signing any documents until Robert could review everything personally. It was a compromise he hoped would satisfy both sides. Cassandra seemingly agreed without resistance, but Isabella noticed an almost imperceptible tension in her expression. It was as if she were quickly recalculating her options and adapting her strategy to the new situation. For an experienced con artist, setbacks were just obstacles to be overcome. After Richard left for the office, Cassandra claimed she needed to make some calls to the investors, explaining the change in schedule and rescheduling the formalization of the documents. She said she would go up to the bedroom for more privacy during the conversations, as they involved confidential information that couldn't be discussed in open environments. Isabella pretended to be getting ready to go to the university, but in reality she was attentive to Cassandra's every move. As soon as she saw her go upstairs, she strategically positioned herself in the hallway near the master bedroom, trying to catch fragments of the phone conversations. Initially, Cassandra spoke in English, apparently talking to someone about the change of plans and the need to speed up some procedures. Her voice sounded controlled, professional, as if she were dealing with a minor business setback. But then, after a few minutes, Isabella heard the beginning of a new call, this time also in English but with a different tone. Isabella had become fluent in English with her maternal grandmother, Helen, who had lived in the United States in her youth, and always insisted on the importance of speaking languages. At first, Cassandra spoke softly, but gradually her voice grew louder, revealing a growing irritation with the person on the other end of the line. Isabella's heart began to race when she heard Cassandra say in English, "The lawyer is interfering more than we expected. We need to execute the plan today before he can investigate further." The person on the other end of the line seemed to be questioning the feasibility of speeding up the process, because Cassandra replied impatiently, "We have no choice. We've already invested months preparing this target." Isabella felt her legs grow weak when she heard the next part of the conversation. Cassandra was explaining that there were forged documents ready to be presented, that the money would be diverted through a series of bank accounts in tax havens, and that she would have to leave the country later that week. Even more shocking was when she mentioned that, "If the old man finds out anything before the transfer, you know what to do with him." The coldness in Cassandra's voice as she referred to Richard as the old man, and the clear threat implied in her words, made Isabella understand that this was not just a financial scam. Her father was in real and immediate danger. Cassandra and her accomplices were willing to do anything to ensure the success of their scheme. Cassandra continued to explain that she would force the signing of the documents that very morning, claiming urgency from the investors and emotionally pressuring Richard. She said she had already prepared arguments about how hesitation could ruin not only the deal, but also the family's financial future. It was a calculated psychological manipulation, preying on Richard's love for his family and his desire to provide security for Isabella. When she heard Cassandra mention that the bank documents are ready and the transfers can be executed in a matter of hours, Isabella understood that there was no more time for elaborate strategies or careful plans. She had to act immediately, before it was too late. Cassandra ended the call by saying she would leave for Richard's office in an hour and expected to finalize everything before noon. She also mentioned that she had prepared a modified version of the contracts that would look identical to the originals, but would actually contain clauses allowing for the immediate transfer of all funds. Isabella silently went down the stairs and headed to the kitchen, pretending to be preparing a snack to take to the university. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything she had heard and decide on the best course of action. She knew calling Robert was the most logical step, but she also knew he was miles away and might not get to the office in time. She decided the only option was to go directly to Richard's office and confront the situation personally. She grabbed the keys to her car, a birthday gift she had received when she turned 18 and left the house, saying loudly that she was going to the university so that Cassandra would hear and not suspect anything. During the drive to the office, Isabella tried to call Robert, but it went straight to voicemail. She also tried to call her father, but his secretary informed her that he was in a preparatory meeting for the video conference and had asked not to be disturbed. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. When she arrived at the commercial building where Richard's company was located, Isabella discovered that Cassandra had arrived before her. Through the ground floor window, she could see her car parked in the visitors' area. Isabella's heart pounded. Cassandra was speeding up her plans, just as she had said on the phone. Isabella quickly went up to the 35th floor, where the company's main office was. Richard's secretary, Mrs. Davies, an elegant woman in her 60s, who had worked with him for over 15 years, was surprised to see her. "Isabella, how nice to see you, but your father is in a very important video conference with international investors. Your stepmother arrived a short while ago and asked not to be disturbed for any reason," explained Mrs. Davies, not noticing the growing desperation in the young woman's eyes. Isabella tried to explain that it was extremely urgent, that she needed to speak with her father immediately, but Mrs. Davies was firm. Richard had left clear instructions that the meeting was crucial for the company's future and could not be interrupted for any reason, except for a medical emergency. It was then that Isabella heard voices coming from the meeting room. She recognized her father's voice speaking animatedly, probably presenting the company to the supposed investors. She also heard Cassandra's voice, complimenting the information and demonstrating knowledge of technical details that impressed even Isabella. Desperate, Isabella managed to get closer to the meeting room without being seen by the secretary. Through the slightly ajar door, she could observe the scene. Richard was sitting in front of his computer screen, speaking enthusiastically with people who appeared in the video conference. Cassandra was by his side, occasionally participating in the conversation and showing documents to the camera. On the table, Isabella could see several professionally arranged papers, including what appeared to be contracts ready for signing. Cassandra had indeed brought everything prepared, just as she had mentioned on the phone call. It was clear she intended to pressure Richard into signing the documents immediately after the video conference. Isabella knew she had to act fast. She went back to the reception and told Mrs. Davies that there had been a family emergency and she needed to interrupt the meeting immediately. The secretary hesitated, but the urgency in Isabella's voice convinced her that it was indeed something serious. As Mrs. Davies got up to check if she could interrupt the meeting, Isabella took the opportunity to get closer to the room again. It was then she heard Cassandra telling her father, "Richard, the investors are eager to finalize this today. They have other projects waiting and can't wait for Robert's review. If we show confidence by signing now, it will demonstrate our serious commitment." Richard seemed hesitant, mentioning the morning conversation with Robert and the importance of following proper legal procedures. But Cassandra was using all her persuasive power, talking about unique opportunities, mutual trust, and how delays could ruin everything. It was at that moment that Isabella heard the words that made her act, without thinking about the consequences. Cassandra said to the supposed investors, "You can prepare the accounts to receive the funds. The money will be available later today as we planned." Isabella could no longer hold back. She threw open the door to the meeting room and shouted, "Dad, stop, this deal is fake, it's all a scam." Richard's expression was one of total surprise and confusion. Cassandra turned visibly pale, but quickly tried to compose herself. On the computer screen, the people in the video conference seemed equally confused by the sudden interruption. Isabella looked directly into her father's eyes and, with a voice trembling with emotion and urgency, said, "Dad, I heard her on the phone speaking English. She said the documents are fake, that they are accomplices, that they're going to divert all your money, and that if you find out anything, they'll hurt you." Cassandra tried to intervene, saying that Isabella was confused, that she must have misunderstood a work conversation, but her voice sounded forced, and her hands were visibly shaking. Richard looked at his daughter, then at his wife, and then back at Isabella. All the excitement had vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of growing understanding and horror. He knew his daughter better than anyone. He knew she would never make such an accusation without being absolutely certain. "Cassandra," Richard said in a controlled but icy voice, "end this video conference, now." The room fell into absolute silence, with only the sound of three people's heavy breathing and the distant noise of the traffic below. Isabella had just changed the course of everything with her courage to speak the truth, even knowing she might be putting herself in danger. Cassandra knew her elaborate plan had crumbled, but she hadn't yet revealed all the cards she had up her sleeve. The moment of truth had arrived, and no one in that room could predict exactly how it would all end. The silence that settled in the meeting room seemed to echo like thunder amidst the emotional storm that had descended upon the three of them. The glass walls of the office, which usually provided a majestic view of Chicago, now seemed like a fragile barrier against the outside world, while inside that elegant corporate environment, a drama unfolded that could destroy an entire family. Richard remained motionless for a few seconds that stretched into hours, processing his daughter's words. His hands, which minutes before had held documents with the confidence of someone about to make the deal of a lifetime, now trembled almost imperceptibly. His gaze shifted between Isabella, whose face showed a mixture of determination and fear, and Cassandra, who for the first time since they met seemed genuinely surprised and out of control. The video conference was still active on the computer screen, with distant, muffled voices asking in English if everything was okay, if there was a technical problem, if the meeting would continue. But for Richard, those sounds seemed to come from another world, from a parallel reality where everything still made sense, and where the people he trusted were really who they appeared to be. Cassandra was the first to break the deathly silence, with a voice that tried to sound indignant but couldn't hide an almost imperceptible tremor. She took 2 steps toward Richard, extending her hands as if pleading for understanding. "Honey," she said, and even in that word there was something different, as if spoken by a person slightly distinct from the woman he knew. "You're not going to believe this absurd accusation, are you?" Isabella is clearly confused. Maybe she misheard one of my work conversations. "You know how she's always been resistant to our marriage, how she's always tried to find fault with me." Isabella felt a wave of anger rise in her chest with an intensity that surprised her. It was exactly the kind of manipulation Cassandra had used for months, pitting daughter against father, making her seem like a spoiled, possessive young woman incapable of accepting that her father could be happy with someone else. All this time, Cassandra had planted seeds of doubt about Isabella's intentions, insinuating that any objection she made would be the result of teenage jealousy or difficulty accepting the new family reality. But this time, she wouldn't let it happen. Not when her father's life was literally at stake. "Dad," Isabella said, with a determination that surprised even herself, her voice coming out firmer and more mature than it had ever sounded before. "I have concrete proof of everything I'm saying. I heard her on the phone in English, and I understood every word. She talked about forged documents, about diverting your money through a complex network of bank accounts in tax havens, and about leaving the country this week. More importantly, she referred to you as the old man, and said verbatim that if you found out anything before the funds were transferred, her accomplices knew what to do." Isabella's last words echoed in the room like stones thrown against glass. Richard turned slowly to Cassandra, and for the first time since they met, she saw something in his eyes she had never witnessed before: cold, calculating suspicion. It was the same look he gave to dubious business proposals, the same look he used when all his business instincts were activated to detect possible fraud or untrustworthy partners. It was the look that had made him one of the most respected businessmen in the country, and that had protected him from countless scam attempts throughout his career. It was ironic, he thought bitterly, that this natural protection had failed precisely in the environment that should have been the safest of all: his own home, his own heart. "Cassandra," he said, in a controlled but icy voice, each word pronounced with surgical precision, "end this video conference immediately and explain to me word for word exactly what my daughter is talking about." Cassandra hesitated for a moment that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Isabella could see her mind working rapidly, calculating options like a computer processing complex data. She could try to continue denying, but it was clear that Richard had registered every nuance of suspicion in her voice. She could try to convince Richard that Isabella was lying or confused, but the risk was that this would generate even more questions. Or she could try a third strategy, riskier, but one that might still save her from the situation. She chose the last option with the speed of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. With a seemingly reluctant and pained movement, As if each step cost her immense emotional effort, Cassandra went to the computer. Her hands, which Isabella noticed were slightly trembling, typed a few commands on the keyboard as she murmured vaguely articulated apologies to the video conference participants about unexpected and urgent family matters that needed to be resolved immediately. "My apologies, gentlemen, but a domestic situation has arisen that requires our immediate attention. We will need to reschedule our meeting for later today or early tomorrow. We will contact you as soon as possible to confirm a new time." Her voice sounded professional, controlled, but Isabella could detect an underlying tension that wasn't there before. When the screen went dark, leaving only the distorted reflection of the three participants in this family drama, Cassandra turned to Richard with a carefully constructed expression that mixed calculated vulnerability and apparent determination. "Richard," she began, her voice now taking on a confessional tone, as if she were about to reveal something painful but necessary, "I didn't want you to find out this way, but it's true that there is important information I haven't shared with you until now. But the situation is not even remotely like what Isabella is imagining." Isabella felt her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and involuntary admiration for Cassandra's manipulative skill. Even caught, even cornered, she was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to find a way to present herself as the hero of the story instead of the villain. "The truth, Richard, is that a few weeks ago I discovered serious irregularities in the investor's documents," Cassandra continued, now adopting a slightly defensive posture, as if admitting a mistake in judgment but with the best intentions. "I began to suspect that you might be the target of a sophisticated fraud attempt. That conversation Isabella heard was me trying to investigate the situation more deeply, talking to contacts I have abroad about how to proceed without alerting the potential criminals to the fact that we had discovered their intentions. It was a clever and desperate move. Cassandra was trying to turn her exposure into heroism, painting herself as a dedicated and intelligent wife who had uncovered a criminal conspiracy against her husband and was working secretly to protect him. For someone who didn't know all the sordid details Isabella had discovered, this explanation could seem not only plausible but even admirable. But Isabella knew all the details, and she also knew the true nature of the woman standing before them. "That is an absolute and despicable lie," she said with a firmness that made both Richard and Cassandra look at her in surprise. "Dad, she wasn't investigating anything. She was actively coordinating the scam. I heard her say verbatim to her accomplices that they had already invested months of preparation to capture this target, meaning you. She discussed strategies to force you to sign the contracts today, talked about how to pressure you emotionally using concerns about our family's financial future." Richard watched the verbal exchange between his daughter and his wife with growing and increasingly cold attention. His years of experience in complex business and delicate commercial relationships had taught him to identify when someone was being genuine and when they were following a carefully rehearsed script. And something in the way Cassandra was expressing herself, in the specific choice of her words, in the timing of her emotional pauses, sounded definitely calculated and artificial to him. "Cassandra," he said, his voice taking on the investigative tone he used in corporate interrogations, "if you really discovered serious irregularities and were working to protect me, why on earth didn't you tell me directly? Why all this elaborate secrecy? Why not immediately involve our lawyers or the proper authorities? Why conduct secret investigations instead of alerting me so we could deal with the situation together, as a couple should?" Cassandra seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second before answering, and Isabella noticed her eyes dart quickly to the left, a sign her mother Helen had taught her to recognize as indicative of someone inventing a response rather than recalling real facts. "Because I wasn't absolutely sure of anything yet," she said, now adopting a slightly defensive tone, "and I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily or create panic over suspicions that might turn out to be unfounded. You were so excited about this project, so optimistic about the possibilities of international expansion. I wanted to be completely sure before—" "Dad," Isabella interrupted, feeling it was crucial not to let Cassandra complete her false narrative. "She is deliberately lying. I have physical evidence of everything. She keeps a detailed notebook hidden at home with meticulous information about your personal habits, your emotional vulnerabilities, your psychological weak points, and even specific analyses on the best strategies to effectively manipulate you. Furthermore, the notebook contains information about other businessmen who were targets of similar schemes in recent years. Richard's face grew visibly paler, the lines of expression deepening as he processed the devastating implications of what his daughter was revealing. "What exact kind of information?" he asked, his voice now laden with a coldness that made Cassandra take an instinctive step back. Isabella took a deep breath, preparing to reveal details she knew would be painful for her father to hear. "Information on how Mom's death left you emotionally vulnerable and in need of companionship, on how to exploit that vulnerability to gain your total trust. Details about your work and personal schedules, about your closest friends and how to win their approval, about your preferences in every aspect of life, food, music, activities, even intimacy, as if you were a scientific study project for an experiment in psychological manipulation." Cassandra tried once more, her voice now taking on a carefully modulated tone of desperation. "Richard, this is completely ridiculous and absurd. Why would I do something so elaborate and cruel? I love you sincerely. I married you for genuine love, for real admiration of the extraordinary person you are. All this time we spent together was real. All the feelings we shared were authentic." "Because of the money," Isabella said with devastating simplicity. "And Dad, there is even more evidence. I found a forged death certificate hidden among her documents with your full name and correct date of birth, dated for this very week." The impact of these words on the room's atmosphere was like a high-powered bomb detonating in a confined space. Richard stood completely still for long seconds, his mind trying to process the apocalyptic gravity of what his daughter had just revealed. Cassandra turned visibly pale, all the color draining from her face as if she had been struck by a physical blow, and for the first time since Isabella had entered the room, she couldn't find an immediate answer or a convincing explanation. "A death certificate," Richard repeated, his voice reduced to a harsh, disbelieving whisper. With my name." "Yes, Dad. With your full name, exact date of birth, correct home address, indicating death by sudden heart attack." The document was hidden among other papers in her office, along with information on procedures for emergency international bank transfers and instructions on how to access your personal accounts. Richard turned slowly to Cassandra, and the look in his eyes was no longer that of a confused, hurt, or betrayed husband. It was the look of a man who had just understood that he had been systematically deceived and manipulated for months by someone who had planned not only to steal his fortune, but to physically eliminate any possibility of him recovering the funds or reporting the crime. It was the look of someone who discovered he had shared his bed, his home, his most intimate life, with a person who considered his death not only acceptable, but necessary for the success of her criminal plans. "Cassandra," he said, with an icy calm that was infinitely more terrifying than any shout or emotional outburst could have been, "I'm going to offer you one single opportunity to explain to me exactly what is happening here. One single chance to tell me the complete truth about who you really are and what you are really planning. And I strongly suggest you take this opportunity with complete honesty, because if my daughter is correct about any of these monstrous accusations, I will personally ensure that you pay for every lie, every manipulation, every moment of betrayal you have inflicted upon me." Cassandra looked at Richard, then at Isabella, and then back at Richard. It was evident that her mind was racing at top speed, trying to find a viable way out of a situation that had become apparently unsustainable. For a few seconds that stretched into eternities, she seemed to consider continuing with her denials and elaborate explanations. Then something fundamental in her expression changed completely. The carefully constructed mask of the dedicated, vulnerable, and concerned wife simply vanished, dissolving like makeup in heavy rain, and was replaced by a calculating coldness and a hardness that made both Richard and Isabella take an instinctive step back. It was like watching a supernatural transformation, The woman standing before them was no longer recognizable as the Cassandra they knew. It was as if a completely different person had taken possession of her body. "You know what?" Cassandra said, her voice now completely stripped of any pretense or emotional artifice, taking on a casual and almost conversational tone that was deeply unsettling given the context. "She really is much smarter and more observant than I had calculated. I really underestimated your little girl, Richard. That was probably my only significant mistake in this entire project." The transformation was so sudden and complete that it was psychologically disorienting. It was as if a talented actress had completely abandoned a role she had been playing for months and revealed her real personality, which was diametrically opposed to the character she had created. "Yes, it's true," she continued, now speaking with a disturbing tranquility, as if she were discussing the weather or commenting on a television show. "Absolutely everything she discovered and reported is true. The documents are meticulously forged, the investors are experienced and well-trained accomplices, and yes, I was planning to divert the entirety of your liquid assets and disappear permanently. And yes, it is also completely true that if you discovered any aspect of the plan before the full execution of the financial transfer, well, let's just say fatal accidents happen with surprising frequency in the business world." Richard was so profoundly shocked by the direct and remorseless admission that for a moment he completely lost the ability to speak. Isabella, despite knowing the truth and being prepared to confront Cassandra, was equally disturbed by the absolute ease with which she had abandoned any pretense of humanity or decency. "Why?" was all Richard could articulate, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. Cassandra gave a short, bitter laugh, a sound completely devoid of joy or humor. "Why do you think? Money, of course. You have a substantial amount. I desire a significant portion of it for my own purposes. It's really that simple. There's no emotional or psychological complexity involved. But you repeatedly said you loved me. We got married in a ceremony that seemed genuinely emotional for you. I trusted you completely. I shared my deepest feelings with you, my vulnerabilities, my fears about the future. And it was precisely that impressive ability of yours to trust and open up emotionally that made you the absolutely perfect target for the kind of operation I conduct," Cassandra replied, without showing any trace of remorse, regret, or basic humanity. "Wealthy, successful man, alone for years after a traumatic loss, desperately in need of companionship and emotional connection, with a daughter who would soon be leaving home for college and an independent life, leaving you even more isolated. You are practically an invitation engraved in gold for exactly the kind of work I perform professionally." "What kind of work?" Richard asked, although a growing part of him was already beginning to understand the horrific answer. "I meticulously study men like you, learn their specific psychological vulnerabilities, identify their unmet emotional needs, transform myself into precisely the person they most desperately want to find, and then I extract from them everything possible before permanently moving on to the next project." Cassandra spoke as if she were describing a conventional career in business consulting. "You were definitely not the first, and you most certainly would not have been the last target." Isabella felt a wave of physical nausea upon hearing the mechanical coldness with which Cassandra described the systematic manipulation of her father. It was even more disgusting than she had imagined possible. This was not simply an opportunistic financial scam, but a professional, cruel, and calculating modus operandi practiced repeatedly against vulnerable men. "The other men you mentioned," Isabella asked, her voice trembling slightly, "what exactly happened to them when you finished extracting what you wanted?" Cassandra looked at her with something that could have been interpreted as professional admiration if it weren't so completely devoid of any recognizable trace of humanity. "Some had the intelligence or luck to uncover aspects of the plan prematurely, as your little amateur investigation managed to do. Others only realized the extent of their error in judgment when it was too late to recover their assets or take effective legal action. Some experienced those sudden cardiovascular accidents I mentioned earlier." The room was plunged into an absolute and horror-laden silence. Richard was looking directly at a person who had shared his home, his bed, his most intimate and vulnerable moments, and discovering that she was not just a complete stranger, but a professional predator who had chosen him as a designated victim, studied his weaknesses with scientific precision, and planned not only his financial ruin, but potentially his physical elimination. "And now?" Richard asked, his voice controlled but filled with an almost unbearable tension. "What exactly happens now that you have been completely discovered and exposed?" Cassandra seemed to consider the question with the same casualness she might ponder menu options in a restaurant. "Well, obviously my meticulously crafted original plan can no longer be executed, as scheduled, but I always develop multiple alternative scenarios for unforeseen situations like this." She calmly walked over to the table where the documents for the supposed international deal were arranged and picked up an elegant leather folder that Isabella hadn't noticed before. "You see, even if I can't obtain the substantial amount I had originally planned, I still possess some rather valuable strategic cards to negotiate with." She methodically opened the folder and revealed what appeared to be an organized collection of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be recorded conversations. "During these months of living intimately with you, Richard, I have collected an impressive amount of extremely interesting information about various aspects of your business operations. Some practices that, while possibly technically legal, would certainly not look good if exposed publicly or examined by hostile tax authorities." Richard felt a familiar tension rise up his spine. "What specific kind of practices?" "Oh, nothing categorically illegal, don't worry unnecessarily, but some creative and sophisticated tax strategies, some specific agreements with international suppliers that could be misinterpreted or presented harmfully, some political contributions and donations that could seem like attempts at influence or corruption when taken out of context." Cassandra arranged the documents as she spoke, as if preparing a business presentation. "You know perfectly well how the tabloid press loves a juicy business scandal, especially involving successful public figures." Isabella immediately understood the nature of the strategy Cassandra was employing. Even discovered and completely exposed, she was still trying to gain an advantage from the situation through sophisticated blackmail, using information collected over months of intimate access to Richard's personal and professional life. "So my proposal is quite simple and reasonable," Cassandra continued, with the tranquility of someone negotiating a routine business contract. "You allow me to leave peacefully, and without interference, accompanied by a modest but adequate financial compensation for the months of intensive dedication and hard work I invested in our relationship, and these potentially troublesome documents disappear permanently with me. Everyone is reasonably satisfied. No one suffers unnecessary damage." Richard examined some of the photographs in the folder, and Isabella could see from his expression that he recognized several of the situations depicted. Cassandra had been even more meticulous and comprehensive in her preparation than anyone had imagined possible. "What amount do you consider adequate?" Richard asked after a long and tense silence. $5 million would be a reasonable and proportional value. Admittedly, it's only a modest fraction of what I would have gotten through the full execution of my original plan, but it would be enough to establish myself comfortably in another country and start a new professional project under different circumstances. Isabella was absolutely horrified. Even completely discovered, unmasked and exposed as the criminal she was, Cassandra was still trying to extort millions of dollars from her father, and from what she could interpret in Richard's complex expression, the blackmail might work. "Dad," Isabella said with all the firmness she could muster, "you absolutely cannot give in to her blackmail. Doing so would only show that she can still manipulate and control you, even after everything we've discovered about who she really is." Cassandra directed a cold, calculating smile at Isabella that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. "Your daughter is technically correct, of course, but the final choice is exclusively yours, Richard. $5 million and all these potentially embarrassing documents disappear forever, or we can risk finding out how the newspapers and authorities will interpret this information when presented out of context." Richard remained silent for a period that seemed to stretch, on indefinitely, clearly weighing his limited options and the potential consequences of each available path. Isabella could see the intense internal struggle he was waging between the desire to protect his carefully built professional reputation over decades and the determination not to yield to the wishes of someone who had betrayed him so completely and monstrously. It was then that he did something that deeply surprised both Cassandra and Isabella. He smiled. It was a small, cold, but unmistakably genuine smile. "You know, Cassandra," he said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "there is something very important that you apparently did not discover about me during all these months of meticulous observation and intensive study. Something significant that all your research and analysis completely failed to reveal." Cassandra seemed genuinely disconcerted for the first time since she had abandoned her elaborate charade. What would that be? "I did not reach the position I hold today by being easily intimidated by threats or blackmail, no matter how sophisticated. And I definitely have not stayed at the top of the American market by yielding to extortion, even when presented professionally." Richard calmly picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number he evidently knew by heart. "Robert? Yes, I need you to come here immediately, and please bring those contacts you mentioned having at the FBI and the International Financial Crimes Division. We have a situation that requires urgent, specialized attention." The expression on Cassandra's face changed rapidly from calculated confidence to genuine concern. "Richard, you are making a potentially costly mistake. Those documents I showed you will be carefully examined by forensic experts who will determine if they are legitimate or simply another one of your elaborate professional forgeries," Richard interrupted with authority. "And even if some are authentic, I would rather face any potential consequences related to my business past than give a single cent to someone who meticulously planned my death." Isabella felt a powerful wave of pride and relief flood her chest and spread throughout her body. Her father had completely recovered his characteristic strength, his legendary determination, and was taking full control of the situation with the same competence he showed in corporate boardrooms. Cassandra, clearly realizing that her last strategic card had failed spectacularly, tried a different and desperate emotional approach. "Richard, you need to understand something important. Despite everything that has been revealed here, I really did develop genuine feelings for you during the time we spent together. Not everything was completely feigned or calculated." "Stop immediately," Richard said, with a coldness that cut through any remaining pretense. "Do not make this already despicable situation even worse by trying to pretend there was any real or authentic element between us. You systematically planned my death, Cassandra. That transcends any justification or rationalization you can invent." It was at this crucial moment that the door to the room opened and Robert entered quickly, clearly concerned, accompanied by two men wearing professional suits who were obviously law enforcement authorities. Robert had managed to arrive more quickly than anyone had expected. "Richard," Robert said, visibly relieved to find his client safe and unharmed, "I received your urgent message and came immediately. These are Detectives Smith and Carter, from the Specialized Division for Complex Financial Crimes and International Fraud." Cassandra looked at the police officers and then back at Richard and Isabella. For the first time since she had completely abandoned her elaborate charade, she seemed genuinely worried about her deteriorating situation. "Gentlemen," Richard formally addressed the detectives, "this woman systematically planned to execute a multi-million-dollar scam against my company, forged multiple official documents, including a fake death certificate with my name and correct personal information, and made specific threats against my physical safety and life. My daughter uncovered the scheme through her own investigation and has comprehensive evidence of the entire operation." Detective Smith approached Cassandra professionally. "Ma'am, could you accompany us to the station for some necessary clarification?" Cassandra looked around the room carefully, clearly evaluating her remaining options and possible escape routes. For a tense moment, Isabella thought she might try to flee dramatically or create some kind of physical disturbance. But then, as if a final vestige of strategic calculation had taken control of her decision-making, Cassandra simply nodded with apparent resignation. "Of course," she said with a surprising calm that was almost more unsettling than open resistance would have been. "But you will eventually discover that this is all a tremendous misunderstanding, based on incorrect interpretations. As the officers calmly escorted her toward the exit, Cassandra turned one last time to face Richard and Isabella directly. "You really think you've won something significant," she said, her voice carrying an ominous undertone. "But you don't even remotely understand half of what's coming for you." With that last enigmatic and potentially sinister threat, she was escorted out of the room, leaving father and daughter alone with Robert and a heavy, oppressive silence, filled simultaneously with profound relief and complete emotional exhaustion. Isabella finally allowed herself to release all the tension that had been building over the past few days, and for a moment her legs seemed unable to support her weight. Richard noticed immediately and quickly embraced her tightly. A hug that carried months of gratitude, unconditional love, and profound admiration for the extraordinary courage she had demonstrated. "You literally saved my life," he whispered directly in her ear, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved not only my physical life, but you also saved me from financial ruin and potentially decades of guilt and self-doubt." Robert, observing the emotional reunion between father and daughter, smiled discreetly and began methodically organizing the documents Cassandra had left scattered behind. There was still a lot of technical work to be done to clean up the entire mess she had created. But for now, the most important elements were successfully resolved. The Shaw family had survived its greatest test and emerged significantly stronger and more united than they had ever been before. The days following Cassandra's arrest were an emotional roller coaster for the Shaw family. What began as an almost unimaginable nightmare gradually transformed into an experience of rebirth and discovery about the true strength of family bonds and the power of intuition when guided by genuine love. The morning after the arrest, Richard woke up in his house for the first time in months, feeling truly safe. The silence that hung over the Lincoln Park brownstone was no longer laden with hidden tensions or unspoken lies, but with a peace he had forgotten was possible to experience. For the first time since meeting Cassandra, he was able to have his breakfast without worrying about carefully chosen words or gestures that might be misinterpreted. Isabella came down to the kitchen wearing a cotton robe that had belonged to her mother, a piece she had kept for years as a way of keeping Helen present in her daily life. When Richard saw her, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. It wasn't just the robe that touched him, but the expression on his daughter's face. For the first time in months, Isabella looked genuinely relaxed, as if an invisible but suffocating weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Good morning, Dad," she said, pouring herself some fresh orange juice. Her voice carried a lightness that Richard hadn't heard in a long time. "How are you feeling?" It was a simple question, but loaded with deep meaning. How was he feeling? Betrayed, obviously. Humiliated for having been so completely deceived by someone in whom he had placed not only his trust, but also his heart. Relieved to have escaped a situation that could have resulted in his death. But above all, deeply proud of his daughter's courage and intelligence. "I feel like someone who just escaped a car crash," Richard replied, trying to smile. Confused, grateful to be alive, and at the same time trying to process how it all happened. Isabella sat beside him at the mahogany table that Helen had chosen when they moved into that house almost 20 years earlier. "Dad, I'd like to talk to you about a few things. About what happened, about what I discovered, and also about what this means for us going forward." Richard nodded, acknowledging that this conversation was not only necessary but crucial for them both to overcome the trauma and move on in a healthy way. "I want you to know," Isabella began, choosing her words carefully, "that during this whole time, I never doubted your right to be happy or to find someone special. My resistance to Cassandra was never because I didn't want you to find love again." Richard felt his eyes well up with tears. For months, a small part of him had wondered if Isabella's reservations about Cassandra were motivated by jealousy or difficulty accepting changes in the family dynamic. Hearing his daughter express these words was like a balm for emotional wounds he didn't even know he had. "What bothered me," Isabella continued, "was something I couldn't rationally explain at the time. It was as if my intuition was screaming that something was wrong, but I had no concrete evidence to justify that feeling. Remember when Mom used to say that the women in our family have a special radar for people? Richard smiled through his tears. Helen did used to say that, especially about Isabella. She always believed her daughter had an exceptional ability to read people and situations, an intuition that went far beyond conventional, analytical intelligence. "Your mother was right about that radar of yours," he said, "and I should have trusted it more, instead of being so blinded by the possibility of companionship and what I thought was love." At that moment, the house phone rang. It was Robert calling to update them on the legal developments of Cassandra's case. The conversation that followed would reveal information that would leave both father and daughter even more impressed with the scale of what they had faced. "Richard," Robert said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief, "you need to know what we've discovered about Cassandra in the last 24 hours. The investigation has revealed something much bigger than any of us imagined." Richard put the call on speakerphone so Isabella could follow along. "What did you find out?" "Cassandra is part of a sophisticated criminal organization that operates internationally. She's not just an individual con artist, but part of an organized network that targets successful businessmen in several countries. The operation is so elaborate that they maintain detailed files on hundreds of potential victims." Isabella and Richard looked at each other, both understanding that they had faced something much more dangerous than an isolated scam. Robert continued, "They uncovered an operations center in a commercial building downtown, with computers containing information on more than 50 businessmen who were being monitored as potential targets. Richard, you were at the top of their priority list." The revelation sent a chill down Richard's spine. "Why?" "Apparently, you met all the criteria they look for: substantial wealth, a history of stable relationships indicating a capacity for deep trust, a prolonged period of loneliness after a significant loss, and a daughter who would soon become independent. To them, you were the perfect target." Isabella felt a mixture of anger and nausea, hearing how her father had been reduced to characteristics on a list of criteria for victimization. "Robert, how many people did they manage to deceive before they got to my father?" "That's the most shocking part," Robert replied gravely. "We've found evidence of at least 12 similar cases in the last 5 years. Some targets only lost money, others—" He paused, clearly hesitating. "Others what?" Richard asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Others died in circumstances that were classified as accidents or natural deaths at the time, but are now being re-examined by the authorities. Richard, if Isabella hadn't uncovered the plan when she did, you could have become the 13th victim." The silence that followed was heavy and laden with terrifying implications. Isabella reached out and held her father's hand tightly, both processing the magnitude of the danger that had been averted. "There's more," Robert continued. "The investigation revealed that Cassandra had planned to significantly accelerate the original timeline after your interference yesterday. They found evidence that she was preparing her escape for that very night, right after forcing the signing of the documents. If you had signed yesterday—" Richard didn't need to hear the rest of the sentence to understand. Isabella had literally saved his life with only hours to spare. "Robert," Isabella asked, "what will happen to her now?" "With the evidence that has been collected, including the photographs and information you documented, Isabella, in addition to the entire criminal operation that has been dismantled, Cassandra is facing multiple federal charges: aggravated fraud, forgery of public documents, racketeering, and the authorities are investigating possible charges related to the suspicious deaths. She will likely spend decades in prison." After the call ended, father and daughter remained silent for a few minutes, processing the enormity of what had been revealed. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Isabella," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have no words to express my gratitude. You not only saved my life, but you probably saved the lives of future victims who would have been targeted by this organization." Isabella felt tears stream down her face. "Dad, I just did what any daughter would do for someone she loves. Mom always taught me to trust my intuition and to fight for the people who matter." "Your mother would be incredibly proud of you," Richard said, hugging his daughter. She always said you had a special strength, a courage that was beyond your years. Yesterday I saw exactly what she was talking about. In the following days, the story spread through the national media. Brave daughter unmasks international ring of con artists was one of the headlines that appeared in the country's major newspapers. Isabella found herself at the center of a media attention she had neither sought nor desired, but which brought an unexpected and positive consequence. Isabella's courage inspired other people who had been victims of similar scams to report their experiences. Over the following weeks, more than 20 people contacted the authorities reporting suspicious situations involving romantic partners who exhibited characteristics similar to Cassandra's. One of those calls came from a businessman from Denver named Edward Marks, who had lost a fortune in circumstances very similar to what Richard had almost faced. "I saw your daughter's story on television," he said during a phone conversation with Richard, "and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel like a complete idiot for being deceived. Seeing that this happened to a respected businessman like you made me realize that anyone can be a victim of professional manipulators." This conversation gave Richard an idea that would significantly change the course of his life and his company. He decided to create a foundation dedicated to educating people about sophisticated scams and supporting victims of organized financial crimes. Isabella was instrumental in the conception and planning of this initiative. "Dad," she said during a planning meeting, "I think we should focus not only on education, but also on research into the psychological aspects of these crimes. People need to understand that being a victim of manipulation is not a character flaw, but the result of sophisticated techniques developed by professional criminals." The Shaw Foundation for the Prevention of Financial Crimes was officially launched 6 months after Cassandra's arrest. Isabella, who had decided to pursue a specialization in criminal psychology in addition to her business degree, became the director of educational programs for the foundation. The foundation's work not only helped hundreds of people, but also further strengthened the bond between father and daughter. Working together on something so significant, they discovered aspects of each other they had never explored before. "You know," Richard said to Isabella one afternoon while working together at the foundation's office, "your mother used to say you would be a natural leader when you grew up. She was right, but not just in the business sense I imagined. You are a leader in the deepest sense of the word, someone who inspires others to be brave and to do the right thing." Isabella smiled, feeling Helen's presence almost tangible in the room. "I feel like Mom is with us in this work, as if she's guiding our efforts to turn something terrible into something positive." A year after the traumatic events, the Shaw family's life had found a new balance. Richard had become more cautious in personal relationships, but also more connected with his daughter, and more dedicated to causes that truly mattered. He had learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, and discovered that being alone did not mean being incomplete. Isabella had grown extraordinarily during that period. The experience of saving her father had revealed abilities she didn't know she possessed: courage under pressure, investigative skills, and a refined intuition about human motivations. These qualities not only made her an effective leader at the foundation, but also an exceptional student and a remarkably mature young adult. On a Saturday evening, father and daughter were having dinner together at home, a tradition they had resumed and which had become sacred to them both. The conversation flowed naturally between family matters, plans for the foundation, and reflections on the future. "Dad," Isabella said, pouring herself more wine. She had turned 21 a few months earlier. "I've been thinking a lot about relationships and trust since everything that happened." Richard looked at her attentively. He knew his daughter had become more cautious with new people, and he worried that the experience with Cassandra might have affected her ability to trust and open up to future relationships. "What have you been thinking?" "I realized that the problem wasn't that you trusted, but who you chose to trust. Trust itself is a beautiful and necessary quality. What we need is to better develop our ability to identify who deserves that trust." Richard was impressed with the maturity of his daughter's reflection. "That's a very important and wise distinction. And I also realized," Isabella continued, "that the love that exists between us and that existed between you and Mum is so different from what Cassandra was faking that they shouldn't even have the same name. Real love grows slowly, is based on true knowledge of the other person, and is strengthened by time and challenges. How did you come to that conclusion? By observing our relationship, she answered simply. By observing how we supported each other during the crisis, how we grew together through it, how we became closer even while going through something so difficult. That is real love, not that theatrical performance Cassandra was putting on. At that moment, Richard understood that his daughter had not only saved his life, but had also learned lessons about relationships and life that many people take decades to discover. The traumatic experience had transformed into growth and wisdom. "Isabella," he said, "I hope that when you find someone special, and you will, that person has the wisdom to recognize the extraordinary woman you have become." "And I hope," she replied with a smile, "that when you are ready to open yourself up to love again, if you are, that you trust your experience and our family intuition to choose someone who truly deserves you." 2 years later, the Shaw Foundation had become a national reference in the prevention of sophisticated financial crimes. Isabella had graduated from business school with honors and started a master's degree in forensic psychology. Richard had found a new purpose that went far beyond business success. On a Friday afternoon, they were reviewing proposals for a new foundation program when the secretary announced an unexpected visitor. It was Detective Smith, who had led the investigation into Cassandra. "Mr. Shaw, Isabella," he greeted respectfully as he entered the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Richard replied. "How can we help you?" "Actually, I came to bring you some important news about the Cassandra case. The trial for her and the other members of the organization has finally concluded." Isabella and Richard looked at each other. They had followed the legal process from a distance, focusing on moving forward rather than constantly reliving the trauma. Cassandra was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years, the detective informed them. The other members of the organization received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. More importantly, the investigation you helped trigger resulted in the complete dismantling of the international network. "Does that mean there are no more potential victims being targeted by this specific group?" Isabella asked. "Exactly, and more. The information collected was shared with international authorities, resulting in the arrest of similar cells in other countries. You literally helped save hundreds of potential lives." Richard felt a deep sense of closure and purpose. The nightmare that had almost destroyed his family had become a catalyst for protecting countless other families. "There is one last thing," the detective said, hesitating slightly. "Cassandra requested a meeting with you. She claims to have something important to say, something related to an apology or clarification. You have no obligation to accept, obviously." Isabella and Richard looked at each other again, communicating silently, in the way only close families can. "We appreciate the information," Richard replied, "but we have no interest in reliving that experience or giving her an additional opportunity to try to manipulate the situation." "I understand perfectly," the detective said. "Frankly, I would recommend that decision as well." After the detective left, father and daughter remained silent for a few moments, each lost in their own reflections on the symbolic closure that this news represented. "How do you feel?" Isabella asked her father. "Relieved," Richard answered honestly. "Relieved that it's over, relieved that other people are protected, and especially relieved that we chose to move forward instead of letting that experience define us." "I feel the same way," Isabella agreed, "and I also feel proud of us, of how we handled everything, of how we turned something destructive into something constructive." That night, they did something they hadn't done in a long time. They looked at old photo albums together, especially pictures of Helen. Instead of the sadness that used to accompany these memories, they felt gratitude and connection. "You know what I think Mom would say about all this?" Isabella asked, looking at a photo of Helen smiling, in the garden of their home. "What do you think she would say?" "She would say we are exactly where we are supposed to be. that we went through the fire and came out stronger, wiser, and more united. She would say this was always the plan, that I would save you. You would teach me about courage and leadership, and together we would help other people." Richard smiled, feeling the deep truth in those words. "Your mother always believed that everything happens for a reason, even when we can't see what it is at the time. And now we can—" "See," Isabella said. "The reason was to turn us into the people we needed to be to make the difference we are making." 3 years after that terrible day in the office, Isabella was graduating with honors from her master's program in forensic psychology. Richard was in the audience, applauding proudly as his daughter received multiple academic awards and recognition for her work at the foundation. During the graduation speech, Isabella was chosen to represent her class. When she took the podium, she could see her father in the audience, smiling with a pride that radiated like sunlight. "Esteemed professors, family and colleagues," she began, her clear and confident voice echoing through the auditorium, "I want to talk today about the transformative power of courage and intuition. A few years ago, I faced a situation where I had to completely trust my intuition to protect someone I love. It was frightening to question the reality that was presented to me. It was difficult to insist on the truth when everyone around seemed to see something different. But I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting rightly in spite of fear." Richard felt tears of pride stream down his face as he listened to his daughter turn her traumatic experience into inspiration for others. "I learned that our intuition, especially when guided by love and genuine concern for others, can be our most reliable guide. I learned that facing the truth, even when it is painful, is always better than living a comfortable lie. But most importantly, I learned that we can transform our most difficult experiences into tools to help others, that we can choose to allow our pain to make us more compassionate, our vulnerability to make us stronger, and our wisdom gained through suffering to make us capable of preventing others from going through the same hardships." When she finished her speech, she received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but the most significant moment was when she stepped down from the podium and hugged her father, both knowing they had not only survived the storm but had emerged from it as better and more complete people. Today, 5 years after that fateful day, the Shaw Foundation is internationally recognized as a leader in the prevention of sophisticated financial crimes. Isabella runs the organization with a competence and compassion that inspire both employees and the people the foundation helps. Richard remains actively involved in the family business, but also dedicates significant time to speaking about financial security and healthy relationships. He never remarried, but found a peace and completeness that do not depend on a romantic partner. The relationship between father and daughter has become an example of how tragedies can strengthen family bonds when faced with honesty, courage, and mutual love. They are partners not only in business but in life, supporting each other and working together for causes that matter. In quiet moments, both still think of Helen and feel her presence guiding their decisions. They believe she somehow orchestrated the events that led Isabella to save Richard, not only from physical death, but also from the spiritual death that would have come with continued betrayal and manipulation. The story of the Shaw family has become a powerful testament to the importance of trusting our instincts, valuing the people who truly love us, and having the courage to face difficult truths. Most importantly, it demonstrates that even the most traumatic experiences can be transformed into strength, wisdom, and purpose when faced with love and determination. Isabella often says in her talks, "My mother used to teach me that the women in our family have a special radar for people and situations. I learned that this radar works best when it is fueled by love and genuine concern for the well-being of others. Trust your intuition, especially when it is trying to protect someone you love." And Richard adds, "I learned that being alone and being lonely are completely different things. I can be alone and feel complete when my life has purpose, and I am surrounded by the true love of family and friends. Desperate love that seeks to fill voids is vulnerable to manipulation. Love that comes from a place of completeness is capable of recognizing and attracting authenticity." End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Richard and Isabella has deeply touched your hearts and sparked important reflections on courage, intuition, and the transformative power of true family love. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, the courage of a person who loves us can light the way and save not only our lives but also our souls. If this narrative moved you, if you identified with Isabella's struggle to protect her father, or with Richard's journey to rebuild his life after betrayal, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. In the comments, share with us which moment marked you the most, what lesson you will take into your own lives, or if you have ever been in situations where you had to trust your intuition to protect someone dear. Every day, we bring you intense and touching stories like this one, narratives that explore the deepest and most complex aspects of human nature, the dilemmas we all face, and the choices that define who we truly are. Each story is carefully crafted, not only to entertain, but to inspire, move, and make you reflect on your own life journeys. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, where a new story of overcoming, love, and transformation awaits. Until then, always remember to trust your intuition, value those who truly love you, and have the courage to face the truth, even when it is difficult to accept.